Hello. That's me, pretty much known as First Vamp on most things. I work for Canonical, as mentioned, in online services, which means if you have anything to complain about Unity, don't ask me. I work with web services and deploying them. I love open source, and I try to contribute as much as possible. So, Juju. Has anyone heard of Juju before? Few hands, yeah. Those people who have heard of Juju usually think of it as a configuration management system. So like Puppet or Chef, Ansible, Salt, etc. Its actual main purpose in life is as a service orchestration framework, toolset, daemon. That means that rather than thinking about your applications and your servers at the server level, so at the machine level, Juju encourages you and encapsulates everything itself at the service level. So rather than I'm going to deploy a bunch of VMs and they're going to run Postgres on it and I have to faff about with all these other things to do with deploying Postgres onto those VMs, I think about deploying Postgres itself. That is the service. And I think about deploying my application. That is another service. And I connect the two together. I don't care that they're running on VMs, that they're running on containers, that they're running on hard metal itself. I just care about the service. And Juju has a set of tools for creating those services and creating what's known as a relationship between them, the connection between those services. I like to think of it sometimes as a bit of vagrant for actual production environments. In fact, the Juju command line has very much a Juju deploy, Juju run, Juju do this, Juju add something. And it's very much the same way in which you might use vagrant to initialize something and then run a bootstrap on it. It's not just for Ubuntu. It is mostly for Ubuntu because it's made by Canonical. But it is now being deployed onto Windows machines. There have in the past been forks for Debian and Red Hat-based stuff like CentOS, and those are actually on the roadmap to be fully supported as well. For the most part, it will mostly work just with Ubuntu best at the moment, but in the future it will be better. I'll give another sort of disclaimer in that although I work for Canonical, I use Juju before working for Canonical, and I use Juju every day in my actual work life, as opposed to working on Juju itself and being a salesman who's here to shill Juju to you. I'm not. I use Juju as a tool. I find it incredibly handy, and even if I wasn't working for Canonical, I'd probably use it for the odd thing. So you might want to wonder why you care about using service orchestration as opposed to just configuration management. Well, it makes scaling really easy, because when you think about everything as a service, then you're not caring about, am I deploying a bunch of VMs? Am I deploying a bunch of machines? I can swap and choose between running services individually on any kind of platform. So you can run LXCs on one host and a bunch of VMs in a cloud provider. And Juju makes that really easy because it actually allows switching between backends. So there's an EC2 backend, a OpenStack backend, which is what a lot of people use. There's other backends such as the local provider, which uses LXCs for lightweight containers locally on your machine. And a bunch of other ones coming out, like there's soon to be a DigitalOcean provider fully supported, and a few others. And the ability of that also means that because of the local provider is built in, you can deploy LXCs onto a host, as well as deploying into VMs themselves. And that sort of scalability is really powerful, and also really easy to do with something like Juju, which gives you this framework. The other thing is it makes configuration itself a top-level thing. You're not caring about configuring the data of a bunch of different services and utilities, such as how do I set up Postgres? How do I set up HA proxy? How do I set up this other thing? You, for the most part, set a few lines of configuration for those things, just standard stuff, and then you care about the configuration for your app. So what gets loaded into a Django settings.py or into a JSON file loaded by your Flask app or anything like that. You have this API and this tool set for just setting configuration in a meaningful and repeatable way. And that all is aimed and that all focuses around a thing called charms. So like pretty much all of the tools out there, from Puppet to Chef to Ansible and Salt, they all have their own vocabulary of way of talking about things. Puppet talks about manifests and modules, Chef talks about recipes and modules and plugins, and Ansible talks about playbooks and modules, and Salt talks about pretty much a whole bunch of vocabulary from minions to states. Charms are probably best analogous with recipes in Chef parlance and playbooks in Ansible, states in Salt, and manifests in Puppet. But of course, they're not about configuring the machine. You can do that with Juju. You can do the configuration at the machine level, and there are a bunch of different ways you can do that. But the focus is on configuring the service, setting some settings just for that service to run, independent of how it will run on whatever machine or VM or container it's running under. So a charm is kind of like those things, but at the same time not. So they're obviously from the slide, they're reusable. The key thing about a charm is that they're supposed to distill the best practice for how to deploy and configure something. So as an example, I don't know the first thing about configuring Hadoop and deploying Hadoop or Cassandra. I know a hell of a lot of things about configuring and deploying MongoDB and Postgres and a few other things, and HA proxy. But what if you could take the people who really know about those things, core developers on the project, people who have spent a lot of time deploying them in their own, and take their experience and distill that into an actual package, and then just set a few lines of config and say, okay, this is the best way to deploy that. And that's the idea behind a charm. It's supposed to distill the best practices and the experience of those people. The Postgres charm, for example, that is available in the Charm store, has been developed by one of the core Postgres guys, who's also a sysadmin who's deployed Postgres bajillions of times and knows all the best ways of configuring Postgres for different situations and with different setups. And that means that there is actually several flavors of deployment. So I want to deploy Postgres in this way because it will give me faster writes, slower commits back to different slave servers, etc. But that's the way it fits my my setup. Or I have less reliability and higher throughput, and those different ways. And rather than having to spend hours and hours reading through documentation and through trial and example and basically just screwing up a bunch of deploys to figure out the best way to do those things, the charm distills all that into an automatic package that allows you to just set a setting and carry on with your workday. The charms, as well as being these things like recipes, which say how to deploy something, also give you a bunch of things called relations. And a relation is the connection between services. So services communicate with each other, sending a relation. A little bit more about that in a moment when I talk about a thing called hooks. But as you can see just from that, it's very different at that point to a recipe. So the anatomy of a charm, which as a developer or a sysadmin you probably care more about than anything, because you want to write a charm to deploy your application, as well as deploying a bunch of other stuff. One of the more common demos of Juju is basically a great big, I've just deployed OpenStack, all of OpenStack. here's Swift, and here's the data backend, and here's my VM provisioner, and I've just deployed it with a few buttons, which is all great and good for a demo. But if you're working on an application every day and you want to deploy that service out to the internet and get people actually using it, you care about writing a charm that gets your application out there, and then connecting it to Postgres, HA proxy, all the other things that will make it work in a deployment. So we have the metadata.yaml, which I have in a tab somewhere. This is the base metadata.yaml that you create when you just create a new charm and you haven't filled any of it out. And you can see all it does is it defines a few common things like the description and summary, the things you might imagine that you need to know for a charm if you were to publish this somewhere, such as the Chamstar, so that other people might want to use it. What does it actually do? What categories it fits in, etc. This little thing here, the subordinate, is interesting in that there are two types of charms. There is a regular charm, which is a service. It will probably get deployed onto a VM or container and will run as its own self-contained thing. The subordinate charm is a way of doing something a bit more like regular configuration management, adding basically an add-on to a running service. You deploy subordinate charms onto other running services, which is handy for doing things like adding monitoring to a machine or to a service. You deploy it onto the service and you can add a Nagios monitoring or some other form of monitoring or log collection, that sort of thing. And here are the relations that I talked about before, which are defined as a interface. You don't really have to care about the interface. That's just a name that's given to it to say, what is this type of relation that I'm providing? And that basically means that this charm provides and also consumes different types of relations. Like if I require a relation, for example, your application may require a data relation. I want to know where my database is. I want to know where I'm going to store my stuff. And then when something joins a relation with your service, it'll get fired with that data back over. It's hard to visualize, and I didn't have much time to prepare these slides, as you can tell from my showing you more examples. But that basically means that you get an event fired back with that information that you require, and then you can go, okay, I know where my database is, and I'll write it to a config file. That's where you start to see the advantage of the event-based nature of Juju. When things change in your environment, a database is taken away or added, you'll end up with an event being fired, a relation gets fired, and that data goes to the places where it's required. Your application will know if a new database has joined the cluster, or there's a new HA proxy node to forward data through. As opposed to, so if you've heard of etc.d and Zookeeper, for example, where you have a distributed store of this information, and all of your nodes in the service have to pull that information in. Juju is providing that information as soon as it happens to the service, and there's then a process within the charm to update the configuration, restart or reload the service. And next we have the config.yaml, which is yet again just a YAML file with a bunch of configuration values that the service wants to be set. There are defaults. Temperamental microphone. They might have defaults, or there might be things that you need to require to be set by you being provided to Juju. This isn't something that Juju is going to provide the service with automatically. Unless it's a default, it'll be provided. But this is something that has to be set by the user. For example, you need to set an upstream host name in the HA proxy to respond to requests on a specific name, a specific host name of request that's coming in. Or something like you need the logger to be set in a Django settings something like that. And this just defines those config values that will be expected by the charm and the service. And the hooks directory. So as I was saying before, event-based. All of the there are a specific bunch of events. You can also define your own events, but there are a set of default events that fire. Things like install. When the service is initially created on a VM or LXC and is being installed into the environment, then the install will fire. Or the config changed, which, as the name suggests, is whenever a config value changes. Config change is actually probably the most important hook, because pretty much everything relies on config being changed and then a service being restarted or reloaded. Even after an install, config change will get called. After a restart, config change will get called, etc. Probably the only time in which a config change isn't called is when the service is destroyed. Pretty much everything relies on configuration being changed, updated, and then restarted in some way. So there's a development environment that go along with the hooks, which is, as I mentioned, the local environment. That's the local provider, which deploys onto LXC containers. So obviously that only works on Linux. Although another note, because I'm mentioning LXC and Linux, Juju runs cross-platform. Juju itself, the client, the command line library, command line interface, runs cross-platform. So you can run it on a Mac, you can run it on Linux, you can run it on Windows. On Mac and Windows, if you try to deploy it, there is a certain setup where it will actually deploy into a vagrant host, into a vagrant box. So you're actually literally running a Linux box in Vagrant or VMware or VirtualBox, whatever virtualizer Vagrant actually uses, which will communicate with the Juju client. There's the debug hook. That's incredibly useful. Unfortunately, I probably won't be able to show you it, but I can describe it. I couldn't get my machine up locally. I'll show you the output of Juju when it hasn't managed to start a machine. That's my service pending right there. This is the output of Juju stat, or Juju status, which, as you can imagine, shows you the status of the current environment. It outputs in valid YAML. It can also output in JSON, which actually works as a fairly nice human-readable way of seeing your environment. This is the part you normally don't care that much about. That's the machines. So they may be containers or physical machines. On my laptop here, it's running on LXCs on the laptop. But you have your services down here that shows you information about the service, such as what relations it has with other things, and its current state, which is pending because it couldn't connect to the internet to download a recent cloud image to install on the LXC. The debug hooks are a nice way of debugging if something goes wrong in your hook. You say debug hooked on a service, and when an event fires, you'll end up in a tmux terminal connected to that service at the point at which the event fired. And you can mess around with the machine, fire the event itself with the hook that would have been called, and find out what went wrong. It's an incredibly powerful way of debugging it, and in fact you can even use a real debugger inside that session if you need to. So the hooks themselves and the charms, obviously, because the charms use the hooks, can be written in pretty much anything. A lot of them used to be written in just bash scripts, but most of them are written in Python now. And a few new ones are actually written using Ansible playbooks, which just run locally on the host, because Ansible provides quite a lot of nice tooling around configuring services. As mentioned, the set of default relationships, default hooks, as you can see, are here. Is the config change, install, start, stop, and upgrade charm. These relation named ones here are just the relation name, relation broken, for example. That's if you had your own custom relation called relation name, which you can build other things with. For example, the Postgres one provides a data relation. So you would have data relation changed, joined. Inside there, they're all just bash scripts. But a Python one, for example, can be written by using the nice charm helpers library in Python, which is easy enough to find. And then you can just write things like this, a nice decorator. It says, this is the install hook. And then just write out a bunch of Python, which does stuff. The charm helpers include things like installing stuff with apt and doing other things, or generating things with templates, such as Ginger 2 templates or Cheetah templates, or pretty much any template you want, to be honest. That's generally Ginger 2 at the mostly. Of course, as you can see, you could probably write this in anything you like, not just Python, but as them written in Python, because Python runs on pretty much everything. And those relations, those hooks, are just there as things on the file system. So you want to add a new relation, you just create something new on create a new file on the file system, or a symlink to a file on the file system. I showed you a hooks.py there. In that project, there were just a bunch of symlinking to hooks.py, and a main method which would run the hook dependent, and that's shipped with charm helpers. So Juju itself, I mentioned the command line interface. There's an example. Initializing an environment and deploying an app with Postgres and relating the two. And we need some more redundancy on the database, so we'll scale we'll add 2 extra Postgres units out there, and then we'll find out what the status of it is afterwards. The relation model allows you to create these great big maps of applications, scaled out with 100 units of this, 10 units of that, and then they will send the data, and then Juju will take care of sending the configuration and the change data between all of those different units, regardless of where they're running. There is a GUI called Juju GUI. Here's an example that's on jujucharms.com, which is actually the Chamstar itself, which shows a nice little GUI of the services themselves. This was me just dragging and dropping the Elasticsearch charm, which also used the Kibana charm to generate a Kibana service. And these might have multiple units running inside the services. You might drag and drop some other services onto this. Might not work because I don't have internet. Nope, it didn't fail. I don't tend to use the GUI much because I usually spend most of my time on the command line looking at YAML and restarting and killing VMs. As a note about my work, I probably deploy stuff onto our private OpenStack cluster, sometimes hundreds of times a day, ripping VMs down and pushing them back up again. The reason I tend to do it into the OpenStack cluster is because in staging and production, we're obviously deploying these onto actual staging and production OpenStack environments. So although I might like to develop a charm on lightweight containers locally because it's fast and easy, I like to do actual testing before we go into staging on an actual OpenStack environment. But the ability to tear down and push back up environments like that so many times through a single command, just pushing and pulling, is really handy. As I said, the Juju GUI is really nice, and it's even gotten a lot better now. You can actually drill down into these services and look at all the individual units if you want to. A unit is another piece of the vocabulary for a VM or an LXC or an actual physical machine, whatever the service is actually running on. And services may then have lots of units, obviously. The Chamstar is a public repository of charms for people to use, which you can fork at will and reuse. Some of the charms are on GitHub, some are on Launch, many of them are on Launchpad. Juju itself is on GitHub, and the main development is done for GitHub, so it's incredibly easy to contribute back to. There is in the next release of Juju, I believe you'll actually be able to run your own Chamstar locally, which is quite nice. An example of configuring your application: setting the value. You can see here, setting the value foo equals bar on my app. That could be a value of foo, which is inserted into a Django settings.py, and then your GUnicorn or Apache or uWhiskey service is bumped and reloaded with the latest settings. And that will happen as soon as that config manages to get down to the unit. Another example with the HA proxy charm is setting the global user, the admin user. That will get distributed to whatever unit's needed. And you can see at what point those units are getting that information in the Juju status of the environment. An example from the WordPress charm, setting a preset. So tuning is optimized. I don't know why you wouldn't want your tuning to be optimized. Maybe there are times when you don't want it to be optimally tuned, but that is one of the presets you can set in the WordPress one, and there are similar ones in Postgres, and I think also the Hadoop one and a few others. And that is just a single config that's being set there, but the charm will obviously say, okay, this has been set to that whole load of config, and put files in the right place and restart the right services in order to run in this particular best practice way, as done by hopefully a expert on that particular service. As I said at the beginning, it's not just config management. It can be used as config management, and a lot of people use Juju will use it as their sole CM. One way in which some people do that is to have a base of their units that get deployed, and they'll just use that base image, and that'll be generated somehow, even if someone does it manually with the base config for the host and all the other things. Or they may have a subordinate charm which sets a bunch of stuff on the host when it's done, or maybe even their main application charm or something else sets all this stuff up. But the way I like to think about it is to mainly be service orchestration, and some people do actually mix it with Ansible, Chef, Puppet, etc., Salt, to have those take care of the machines. So maybe all the base image does is say, okay, I need to talk to a Chef server and find what the hell is going on, and then Juju can take care of actually deploying onto those hosts the service itself. I'm actually going to end early because my throat is killing me. I haven't had much sleep, and as I said before, I didn't get a lot of time to do these slides between this and everything else. I'll have the slide talks up after this talk when I have internet again, and I've committed up to GitHub. Juju's at juju.ubuntu.com. There's a few other services such as Juju Deployer, which aren't out there with Juju, but there is an extra utility which is really nice that allows you to deploy from your entire environment from a YAML file or a set of YAML files, which is really quite cool. And there are also a bunch of tools out there such as the charm helpers, which I mentioned, and an Ansible helper as well, done by a colleague called Michael Nelson, which is really handy, especially if you've used Ansible before. The few tiny little illustrations that were in my talks were by Geoff Oliver, who's a good friend of mine and very good artist. If you need him to do any illustrations, please look him up. I have done other talks with a lot more slides with some really nice illustrations in, and I've had a lot of compliments for them, so I like to mention them at the end. And I'm here for basically about 24 hours because I need to skip over to a sprint in Washington at the weekend. So if you want to talk to me, please grab me and say hi. Thank you.
Are there any questions?
Hi. I've got a question about integration with Puppet. I mean, what would Puppet do when you have Juju deploying units?
So, one example, for example, this week, quite relevant, the recent Poodle exploit of SSL3. You may want to have a set of security steps that are done on every host. You probably want to have things like your SSH keys configured. Juju obviously does handle SSH because you can do Juju SSH to a host or to a service, but you probably want an actual set of users for those hosts which have access privileges and keys that are inserted. And you may want to do things like disabling SSL3 everywhere. So yeah, Puppet will do things like that, things that are generic across all hosts, not just to a service.
Oh, okay, thanks.
No problem.
How does Juju integrate with source control? Will I get, for example, if I put those YAMLs in Git, will I get sensible diffs?
Yep. It's just regular YAML, so it diffs quite nicely as long as it's easier if you put things on separate lines, as YAML allows you to. It used to be a case that basically Juju just worked with Bazaar and Launchpad, Canonical, etc. But it's got support for Git repositories now out of the box for actually pulling from a Git repository for your charm, and because and you can basically deploy from any directory now as well. Well, for quite a long time. I mean, we don't actually deploy directly from a Bazaar repository. We package things up into a directory and then say deploy from this directory. So yeah, pretty much it works nicely. The YAML files are easy to diff.
Okay, so thank you.
Thank you.